Hello, Lakeview family. Ooh, I hope you're doing well, staying cool. It's been hot, although we did have a fantastic thunder and lightning storm Wednesday morning this week, which was very cool. I happened to be outside on my patio on a Zoom call, and it was so great. Nothing better than just a massive rainstorm, the rain coming down, metal roof, lightning. Don't worry, the lightning did not strike the metal roof. But to seeing the incredible power and force of nature, which made me think of our passage for this week. So we're starting a new series on prayer. Kind of have two working titles. Mostly we'll see this idea of the ancient paths and talking about ancient practices of prayer. We're going to probably learn three over the course of the next 3 weeks as just another way of us together, as we come together corporately, practicing how we engage in disciplines like prayer so that we have a means of understanding how to do that on our own. Oftentimes, as I reflect on my kind of faith journey, there's a lot of things that I just didn't pick up when people were trying to teach me or model for me the practices and disciplines of the faith. But also, there were things that we did, particularly around prayer, where prayer looked very professional to me growing up. That's why you probably notice we don't have a formal kind of traditional pastoral prayer, because I want us to pray together. I want us to, by doing it together and holding that space together, learn how to pray. And whether that's just quietly in our hearts, as I say every week, or out loud, as I say every week, to me, that time together is us learning. So this series is kind of continuing that and picking up on that. And what are some other things, some simple things we can learn together about prayer as we continue our journey of being disciples. And so this week we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 19, fascinating story with Elijah. And why I thought of that with the storm this week was, if you're familiar with it, and we'll talk about it and kind of give context, but if you're familiar with it, Elijah has just had this incredible feat on Mount Carmel where God showed up and burned his offering and kind of helped him be kind of the boss over all of these prophets of Baal and look really cool and kind of a big deal. And then as soon as that happens, like, God shows up in a powerful way, and that should be enough for Elijah. Remember we talked last week about enough. That should be enough for Elijah. But in the next breath, he hears of a threat from Jezebel that she's going to have him killed. And it's as if what God had just done evaporated from his mind. He freaks out and he bails and goes on this journey. And so there's several verses that follow him down to Beersheba and then on into the wilderness, where he just kind of passes out under the shade tree and says, I just want to die. And he's feeling so sorry for himself and says all these things. And the angel of the Lord says, get up, you need to eat and drink, for your journey is long. It goes on a 40-day journey. We'll talk about some connections with that 40-day number, as well as where he ends up, Mount Horeb, and what that means in the context of the greater story of the Old Testament, and specifically of God speaking to and being present with people. Then he shows up on Mount Horeb, and he's there in a cave. Some translations say the cave, which I'll talk more about that, the difference there. But he's in the cave, hears, right, this crashing wind, earthquake, and fire. And those three things, Scripture says, the wind came, massive windstorm, but God was not in the wind. The fire, God was not in the fire. Earthquake, God was not in the earthquake. But then, in a still whisper, a small voice. There's different translations. A fine whisper is one that is used, and a loud silence is another way that it's talked about, and in the Hebrew is kind of seen as kind of holding those in contrast with each other. So whatever we want to think, God shows up. So we're going to talk this week about this idea of prayer, and the first thing is recognizing there's something with the location, with Mount Horeb, and God knows the principle of real estate, right? Location, location, location. And then begin to help us look at and think about this idea of prayer, how we approach prayer, what prayer means. And that prayer beyond words, which is kind of a subtitle for this Sunday's passage, is prayer beyond words, this idea of silence. So in this passage, we see God show up in the silence. And in all of this is there's all of the noise around Elijah, the cultural noise, Jezebel, all the Israelites who were, again, doing what the Israelites have traditionally done, which is kind of forsaking God and not listening to God's mouthpiece, which is the prophet, which is Elijah. So we see the same thing. And then, so it's those outside cultural voices and that noise, but also it's the inner noise, the inner critic, feeling of failure. Like, these are all things I think that we can relate with, and powerful images to see in this text, which often we miss because it's the man Elijah or Moses or other biblical characters, because we have put them on this elevated pedestal that we don't allow ourselves to fully relate to the reality of their story. But I think there's so much in Elijah's story that we can relate with. Things are going well in life, and all of a sudden things just crash, and we just want to curl up in a ball, fall asleep, get buried under depression, or we literally want to die. Like, this is just an articulation of the human experience. And what does it mean then to bring these things to God in prayer? And what does that look like? So prayer beyond words exposes our insecurity, exposes our fear, exposes our poor theology. Like, if you look at this in terms of what Elijah's words to God especially say about what he believes and thinks about God, his theology has just been hijacked. And that is so often the case for us. And it doesn't mean that we don't believe in God or that we are bad in and of ourselves because we don't think properly. It just means that's the reality, again, of being human, is that we allow ourselves to criticize ourselves, and we listen more to what we think, what we presuppose about ourselves or about God, what we assume about God or about ourselves, or what we've learned, what's been reinforced in our human relationships, all of those things that affect how we come to God in prayer, and it affects us. So prayer beyond words exposes those things, our insecurity, our fear, our poor theology. And what we see is the posture of God invites us in prayer to three things: being present in prayer over performing, being known in prayer over being right, receiving our worth in prayer over proving our worth. And again, God takes him on this journey to this mountain where God traditionally has been known to show up to just remind Elijah that he is there and he is with him. And it's not about anything else in the situations or circumstances that surround Elijah, but it's simply that God sees him and knows him. And meeting God in prayer, particularly in this opportunity of being silent, which then shifts us to thinking about these two pillars of prayer that I see in this text that I think are important, that often points of our struggle for humans seeking relationships with the divine, with God. Is this idea of being honest, honesty in speaking to God, and listening for God to respond. And there's a key way of listening that we'll talk about on Sunday. And I read this really good book, which I'll reference. It's called Where Prayer Becomes Real. And it's been kind of a helpful tool in thinking about this series, and specifically about this idea of being honest and how we just bring ourselves to God in prayer as our vulnerable, humble, real self, which we begin to see in Elijah. But there's a quote from that book. It says, "Prayer is not a place to be good. It is a place to be honest." And Elijah, in some ways, is all wrapped up in performance. Here he has just done this major feat. No one's listening to him, so he's feeling like, no, I'm a bad leader. No one listens to me. I obviously must not be close to God. This isn't working. What is happening? And everything just falls apart. But it's this reminder that especially in prayer, it's not a place to be good. God doesn't want you to be polished in your prayer. You don't have to have all of the things right or the steps or know all of the things. But it's simply a place to be honest with your Maker, who we know knows us in our inmost being. And then that shifts us. It's not that we use words in prayer, but that our use of words often means that we are afraid to listen. So understanding that prayer is not a place to be good, it's a place to be honest. And then recognizing in ourselves that often we're using words in prayer, prayer becomes simply an exercise of us speaking to God because we're afraid to listen. We're afraid of what we might hear. We're afraid of God speaking to us and convicting us on the sin that we know exists in our lives. And rather than, as Elijah could have known from what he experienced on Mount Carmel, he could have known that in spite of all that was coming and the threats from Jezebel, that God was going to be with him and deliver him in the same way he did on Mount Carmel. But because that wasn't happening, because he was listening more to those voices in the culture or the inner critic, he lost it. Anxiety took over, depression, like all these things that we see. Like Elijah's response is what we see in our world today, especially in the church, in reality of mental illness, being overwhelmed with the situation and the circumstance. And we finally see this idea that God's competition with the noise of culture and with our inner critic is not speaking louder, but it's with loud silence. So this Sunday, we're going to practice silence. We're going to think about what that means, and I'm going to challenge us to spend a lot of time in silence and to spend intentional time in silence, as Isaiah 50 verse 4 reminds us, to listen as one being taught, or to listen as a disciple listens attentively. As God is speaking, and he's reminding us that we are loved, that he's with us, that he's present, and that in him we have nothing to fear. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Blessings.